What went wrong in Kentucky? What went wrong in Minnesota? What went wrong in Georgia and so many other places where we are seeing the impacts of police violence and terror, the impacts of an unjust justice system? I say to them, you too probably live in a place where you have a district attorney that will not prosecute the police when they harm or hurt black people.
I keep hearing people say defund the police or eliminate the police department altogether. I don't think that's the right approach. We are not at the level where our society can function without a local police department or a local law enforcement. Therefore, don't defund the police and instead change its mandate to community services, not community murders.
Hey, please, man. Please. Please let me stand. Please, man, I can't breathe. I'm about to just die in your seat. Relax. Man, I can't breathe in my face. Just get up.
What do you want?
Does it look like these officers are doing community services?
You're not even resisting arrest.
No, they're not. They're doing community murder. Look at the hate of these officers kneeling down on the guy's neck. This is not caring, but killing with intention. But first, I would like to say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, to our dear sister Ilhan Umar's father's passing, Mr. Noor Omar Mohammed. Might God forgive him and elevate his station among those who are guided. May God forgive him and forgive us. I urge everyone to protect themselves and follow local guidelines when it comes to coronavirus. As you can see around the news, this is not going away this summer. So, follow your local guidelines when it comes to coronavirus and stay safe. Do not follow Donald Trump. His advice is a sure death sentence for a lot of people. The guy is heartless, moron who will do anything to win. Truly, he's not someone you need to be taking advice from.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
No fucking way. It's not interesting to the rest of us. It's stupid. And even my 5-year-old son won't think it's interesting. I know. We accidentally elected a moron. But hey, everyone makes a mistake. And as a country, due to the hate we have for the black president previously, we stumbled onto the most morally corrupt, incompetent man on earth. But we will eventually forgive ourselves and learn from our mistakes. As a black man who immigrated to the United States in the Y2K era, I'm here to tell you the only thing standing between you, a black man, and being lynched on the street while white onlookers are sipping a beer and cheering is the police themselves.
If a white person did something to you, you had no recourse at all. People disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared.
In the 75 years before Emmett Till set foot in Mississippi, more than 500 black people had been lynched in the state. Most were men who had been accused of associating with white women.
part of that culture was that the women were put on pedestals, and they were some sort of idealization of whatever it means to be woman or to be female. There was an almost irrational fear of black men, as if every black man was ready to attack or rape a white woman if you gave him the chance.
I know you're thinking this is not 1800 lynchings, but it happens. I think it was just a few months ago that a black man was lynched while these protests was going on. But also, we are just under 15% of the population, and we are the least armed group of the population in the United States, mostly because we have been aggressively targeted with false criminal convictions, preventing us from owning a firearm and exercising our Second Amendment rights. Therefore, if police were to be dissolved, who's going to stop the same white people who are doing this back not long ago to us again? Therefore, dismantling the police is not an option we can live with. We also know we are not, at this moment in time, and I'm talking about the minority communities and immigrants, the best behaved community ourselves. So what are our options if we can't dismantle the police and we don't like to be slaughtered on the street by crooked, corrupt police officials protected by the government? I will say, instead of dismantling the police, like a regular employer, since we employ the police, I know it don't feel like that, let's implement policies that work for us. If any of them don't follow, let's terminate them. Like any company would. It's that simple. Yes, the police work for us, even though it doesn't feel like that, because whenever you get stopped by a police officer, they act like a dictator, forgetting who they actually work for. So let's remind them, they work for us. While the police actions can't be controlled by the citizens, because we actually don't elect them, so we can't directly fire them, we can control those who we elect. We can fire the ones we elect, like the mayor, the prosecutor, the judge, and so on. Therefore, we elect those office holders who pursue policies that are fair and just, and if they don't, we kick them out. We don't wait until the end of the term. So how do we hold the police and the elected official accountable? Before I get to that, why is it so hard for police and prosecutors to be held accountable when they break the law and violate our constitutional rights? Well, thanks to the Supreme Court of 1976, it's due to a little-known law called qualified immunity. I will have the expert explain that to you on the next clip.
Qualified immunity is a doctrine that was created by the United States Supreme Court in 1967. The doctrine shields government officials from liability for damages claims, even if they've violated the Constitution, if they've not violated what the Supreme Court calls clearly established law.
When the Supreme Court created qualified immunity, it did so in the terms of the court to protect from liability all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate someone's rights.
There's an ongoing, vigorous debate about whether qualified immunity is important for police officers to have. The Supreme Court in the early 2000s decided a case in which they held that lower courts deciding whether an officer was entitled to qualified immunity had to do two things. One is that there needs to be a constitutional violation.
Do the actions of this officer violate a constitutional right? Yes or no? That officer may still be entitled to qualified immunity by virtue of the second inquiry, which is whether or not that right had been clearly established at the time of this now decided upon violation.
There needs to be a prior court case holding the conduct unconstitutional, sufficiently similar in factual terms to the case before the court, that the factual circumstances of that case would inform the defendant that the conduct was unconstitutional.
If the answer to that question is no, I would give that officer qualified immunity. But at least now we know moving forward, if somebody does something like this again, it has been clearly established.
The Supreme Court explained that that process would help clearly establish the law in the future and give guidance to police officers and police departments about the contours of the Constitution. In 2009, the court said that it was unnecessary for lower courts, when deciding qualified immunity motions, to answer the first question. And that decision has allowed subsequent courts and the Supreme Court regularly to grant qualified immunity, holding that the law was not clearly established, without ruling on the underlying constitutional claim, meaning that the constitutional claim regarding that case remains undefined, and it becomes increasingly hard to clearly establish the law and get past the hurdle of qualified immunity. In the courts around the country, there's a great deal of confusion about what clearly established law means. Can only the Supreme Court clearly establish the law? The Supreme Court recently said that they assumed arguendo that decisions other than those by the Supreme Court could clearly establish the law, but they've never come out and said clearly which courts can clearly establish the law.
It's important for officers to have qualified immunity so that they can perform the discretionary functions of their job without fear of liability. I have talked to many individuals who have told me that in certain situations they knew and recognized that they were entitled to use force, and they told me that one of the things that prevented them from doing so was the fear of being sued after the fact. That's a dangerous situation. Law enforcement officers must be able to do their job, including using deadly force if it's appropriate, without that fear of liability hanging over their head.
When I studied the frequency with which police officers contribute to settlements and judgments and lawsuits brought against them, I found that cities and counties that employ those officers pay more than 99% of the dollars in those cases. So the financial justification for qualified immunity as a shield against the financial burdens of litigation is simply untrue. The Supreme Court should reconsider qualified immunity doctrine because, as Justice Sotomayor has explained, it renders the protections of the Fourth Amendment hollow. When the Supreme Court grants qualified immunity to officers who shoot people without justification, who shoot people against the orders of their supervisors to stand down, it sends a message to officers and to society as a whole that officers can shoot first and think later.
Qualified immunity is not meant to put a roadblock to the courthouse for legitimate plaintiffs who have suffered a violation at the hands of law enforcement. If a law enforcement officer did nothing that constituted a knowing violation or would satisfy a plainly incompetence or almost a gross incompetence level of misconduct, that person should not, that person of law enforcement. If a law enforcement officer did nothing that constituted a knowing violation or would satisfy a plainly incompetence or almost a gross incompetence level of misconduct, that person should not, that person being the law enforcement officer, should not have to defend what he or she did in the courtroom.
From this video, you can see that a cop can shoot without regards for any law, knowing that they will probably not be held accountable for their actions. The law says, as you heard, it's almost impossible to convict a police officer. Even though there have been some convictions, from this video you can see that a cop can shoot without regards for any law, knowing that they will probably not be held accountable for their actions. The law says, as you heard, it's almost impossible to convict a police officer. Even though there have been some convictions, a lot have not been convicted. In regards to holding the prosecutor accountable, Rashid Robinson explains the prosecutor role in police brutality, how they're involved in police brutality, and they are very well involved.
DAs decide whether or not a police gets prosecuted, whether someone gets a long sentence or a light sentence. So right now, as people are asking, what went wrong in Kentucky? What went wrong in Minnesota? What went wrong in Georgia and so many other places where we are seeing the impacts of police violence and terror, the impacts of an unjust justice system? I say to them, you too probably live in a place where you have a district attorney that will not prosecute the police when they harm or hurt Black people. You too probably live in a place where you have a criminal justice system led by a district attorney that is running up all sorts of issues on Black communities. DAs decide whether or not a police gets prosecuted, whether someone gets a long sentence or a light sentence, whether someone gets sent to a diversion program or not. DAs are in charge of so much. The vast majority of people are incarcerated at the local level, so the district attorney has so much power. In fact, they are the most powerful folks in the criminal justice space. There are 2,400 of them, 70% run unopposed. In fact, 90% or more of DAs right now are white. So we actually have to do a lot of work to change the representation, to change the power structure.
We should have elected officials enact laws and policies that make it easier for the public to examine individual police records, have public oversight of police and police policies. Police policy manual should be written to protect the public and the police, not the police. Why would putting someone on a chokehold until the last breath leaves their body be a part of police policy? It's perfectly within their policy to choke someone to subdue them or kill them in several cases. Because when you choke someone who has a condition like heart conditions or someone with asthma, choking them kills them. You're killing them. Since you don't know what condition they have, choking someone out should not be part of the game. In the sports world, if someone chokes you out, you can tap out. But here, you don't tap out. In fact, everyone calling them to tap out, and the officer decides to kill you. So, such policy should not be part of any police training manual or policies. So, instead of eliminating the police department completely, some people are talking about decreasing the budget for the police departments. Look at these stats regarding the police budget. From these studies, you can see we are neglecting community needs and embracing military state-style police.
Men in Kevlar vests and helmets, camouflage, carrying automatic rifles, moving in tactical armored vehicles. These aren't American troops on the battlefield, but police in Ferguson. One observer says he thought he saw police in an MRAP.
An MRAP is a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. It's built to withstand armor-piercing bombs. This is not something that we need in American communities.
But Kara Dansky of the ACLU says more than 500 MRAPs have made their way from Afghanistan and Iraq to local police forces in America just over the past couple of years. It's part of what the ACLU, in a recent report, called the excessive militarization of American policing. Indications of that are everywhere in Ferguson. Police in these towns are getting much of this combat equipment free of charge from the Pentagon. The Defense Department says just in 2013, nearly $450 million worth of military equipment was given to law enforcement. A defense official says Ferguson police only got a couple of Humvees and a trailer. But police departments throughout Missouri, which are assisting in Ferguson, got 20 MRAPs and hundreds of M16 rifles in recent years. Critics say often when they get these weapons, policemen's attitudes change.
Bring it. All you idiots, bring it.
Increasingly, the police are trained to view the people in the communities that they're supposed to be protecting and serving as enemies.
It's not just their possession of all this equipment that's an issue. Watchdog groups say many of these police departments lack the training in how to use these weapons responsibly, and that often escalates the dangers. Dangers like police overreacting when conducting minor operations like serving search warrants.
They will drive up in an armored personnel carrier, raid a person's home, holding assault rifles, holding people at gunpoint, yelling at everyone to get on the floor. This is an extremely traumatic experience, and we've seen over and over again situations like this where people are traumatized and sometimes people are injured and killed.
But current and former police say criminals have increasingly more firepower, and law enforcement can't afford to be outgunned.
If people are shooting at the police and committing looting and other violent acts, then the police need to protect themselves.
The Defense Department supports this trend overall. While it would take you or me 4 to 6 weeks and unending hassle and documentation to secure a passport, as reported by the Washington Post, your local police force need only fill out a one-page form for an armored personnel carrier.
We are not investing in community services like mental health, after-school programs, better schools, and so on. I like this route better, the route of reduction in budget, but there's something missing among these two budgets. The two budgets of reducing the budget or eliminating the police. The option to defund the police and option to reduce police budgets are being thrown around, but the police do what they do because the Justice Department allows them to do so. So there's a third option of dealing with the Justice Department, like the prosecutor's office. While we're focusing on the police, we are not holding those we elect accountable. When George Floyd was murdered, the officer knew he was on live camera, but he didn't care because just like George Floyd, James Clark, David Smith, Tommy Baker, Dominic Felder, James Scott, Lorenzo Dobby, Anthony Williams, Christopher Burns, and Mark Henderson, killers all knew that no one is going to do anything about it because they knew they had the backing of the Justice Department not to intervene in police brutality. So what do I say? Let's go and fix the Justice Department to begin with. Okay? Hold the prosecutor accountable, and you will have a better outcome at police departments without defunding or eliminating the police departments. Because without a police department, I am sure we will have another Tulsa race massacre where police stood by when hundreds of black people were killed by white supremacists. So, what do I say? Let's keep the police departments, let's reduce their budget, let's invest in community services, and let's make sure the Justice Department is being held accountable.